All right, friends, Considering Charlotte is a series that we've begun in order to attempt to better understand what's coming up in the General Conference of the United Methodist Church next month. It's going to be meeting in Charlotte, hence the name of the series. And we have consulted a lot of different topics, a lot of different resources. Last week, we concluded our 3 episodes on regionalization with a guest speaker, Lloyd Neorota, who is one of the authors of the Christmas Covenant. Today, we're going to turn to Joe now, and he's going to present some history on the Episcopacy, and I'll kind of provide like an entree or a preparatory thing, because I've done just some basic historical reading on Methodism, and of course, Methodism has bishops, and the original OG authority figure in Methodism is John Wesley, who was accused of being an autocrat and who was resented very much in America whenever it hopped the pond. Francis Asbury operated similarly, and then the College of Bishops evolved over time. But there's always been a concern about top-down authority. There's always been democratic movements within Methodism to try and keep power among the laity and the clergy and not have so much in the episcopacy. Right now, the Global Methodist Church is trying to discern that as well, how authority is going to work when they're going to have bishops. So this is a big kind of wild picture whenever you look at the historical angle. And Joe, as we're looking at the United Methodist General Conference coming up, what history do you think is important for people to know?
Well, I want to go back even further just to give some preliminary things, just to go back to where the term even comes from. So bishops come from the Greek word episkopos, found in the New Testament, which is a compound word which combines Greek words that mean over and a word having to do with vision. So the idea of oversight or overseer. In fact, it's sometimes translated overseer in English translations. And early bishops, that was clearly an office in the early church. A lot of debate as to what it was. Probably not distinguishable from pastor or elder. And of course, to this day, in the United Methodist Church, bishops are not a separate order. They are elders put in a different role. But I'm going to make a couple points for each of these kind of eras I look at. One is in the early church, and there's always been this idea of going back to the early church, right? Wesley had that idea. Bishops were, first of all, they were pastors. They had regular pastoral duties and responsibilities. They were not administrators sitting in an air-conditioned office somewhere. And they were also defenders and articulators of the faith. One thinks of people like Irenaeus of Lyon in the 2nd century, or later Athanasius in the 4th century, with regard to the Arian controversies. So that's important to keep in mind. So we can fast forward to the founding of the Methodist Church. So basically, the Episcopacy and the United Methodism has been dominated by what evolved out of the original Methodist Episcopal Church in the U.S. as founded in 1784. Of course, the Methodist Church in the U.S. came out of the Anglican Church. Wesley was an Anglican all his life. Wesley functioned essentially as a bishop over the Methodists in England, and as you said, was often accused of being a bit of an autocrat. And when he did things like ordain people, which only bishops do, right, and sent them to America to begin what was then called the Methodist Episcopal Church in 1784. He appointed Francis Asbury as what he called the general superintendent. He didn't like the term bishop, although it was called the Methodist Episcopal Church, which Episcopal means you have bishops. They have an episcopal form of government. When they started using the term a few years later, and because they didn't initially, Wesley got rather angry. He sent a famous letter to Asbury saying, "How dare you let yourself be called a bishop? Men may call me a fool or a knave, but they'll never call me bishop." So that's a little bit of trivia on there. But Asbury was the great shaper of the early episcopacy in American Methodism. And a couple key points about about how bishops functioned in early American Methodism. One was that they were itinerants. They were itinerants just as the preachers were itinerants. They were not resident bishops assigned to a particular conference or episcopal area. They traveled constantly around the country throughout the 19th century. And as a consequence, there were not very many, 4 or 5 in the 1850s, 9 or 10 in the 1870s. And so they would actually, literally, they would say, begin in Boston and oversee the New England Conference and ordain and preach. Then they come down to New York and oversee the New York Conference and ordain and preach. Then they come to New Jersey and then to Philadelphia. And they would have these alternating schedules.
And it's important to remember that at this point in the 19th century, 1 in 3 Americans was a Methodist. So this was a huge, burgeoning, growing
I think it
Methodist
was actually 1
movement.
in 3 church members were Methodists, so it was not quite 1 in 3 Americans. But yeah,
Okay. Okay.
still,
All right.
the Methodists outnumbered the Congregationals, Episcopalians, and Presbyterians 2 to 1 combined. It was the dominant movement of that period. So that's a key thing to recall. By the way, at the same time, there's another strand in our history, which is the Evangelical United Brethren side. And on the Evangelical United Brethren side, evangelical bishops and United Brethren bishops also developed in the early 19th century. The key personalities were a Christian newcomer in the United Brethren Church and John Siebert in the Evangelical Church. Siebert actually was born not far from my church in Lancaster County. In fact, I'm a font of useless historical trivia. His father was a Hessian soldier during the American Revolution who was imprisoned in a barracks that stood on the site of my congregation right now. My church sits on the site of the prison camp that John Siebert's father was interned in. Anyway, I got lots of useless trivia if you want it. Anyhow, interesting about the United Brethren side is that their bishops were limited. They're much more limited. They were elected every 4 years. They had to be reelected. They had less power. They were not lifetime bishops, as was the case in Methodism. Of course, when the merger happened in 1968 between the EUBs and the Methodists, the Methodist strain dominated what came in to define the episcopacy. But there have been efforts to limit the power of bishops. In fact, most recently at the last full general conference, you may remember in 2016, there was a movement to term limit bishops. And actually, the petition to do so got nearly a 60% positive vote on the floor of General Conference. Now, they needed 66.7% to change the Constitution, so it failed. But it gives you an idea of the suspicions among the rank and file about the kind of power that bishops wield. And by the way, that petition was put forth, I believe, by the Association of Lay Leaders of Annual Conferences. It was not a fringe group. I think Lonnie,
Simon and I wrote that petition.
You wrote that. So that was the most recent full general conference. Two key things happened in the 20th century that began to fundamentally alter the way that bishops functioned to move them in a more regional direction or a more diocesan form as we now have them. One was in 1912, they moved from becoming itinerants to being assigned to particular conferences or episcopal areas. And of course, to be assigned to a particular area meant that then that would become kind of a base of operations and a power base, people could say. So that was a fundamental shift. The itinerant nature of the episcopacy had shifted. The other key event, which we've alluded to before, was in 1939, with the merger of the Northern and Southern Methodist Episcopal churches and the Methodist Protestants, the jurisdictional system was created. And this was a fundamental shift because from 1784 till 1939, bishops were elected by the General Conference and were accountable to General Conference. When the jurisdictional system was set up, and of course that was a legacy of segregation and racism, because if you recall, 5 geographical and 1 racial jurisdiction were set up, because as a compromise to unite the church, the Southern conferences did not want to have the possibility of a Black bishop superintending a Southern conference or a Northern bishop superintending a Southern conference. So the bishops then were elected and remained accountable only within and amenable only within their jurisdictions from 1939 onward. And that effectively severed, we didn't realize it at the time, thankfully, severed the accountability of bishops from the General Conference, because General Conference was supposed to be, and still is supposed to be, the governing body of the denomination. Policies that it puts into effect are supposed to be executed by bishops. But now bishops are no longer effectively able to be held accountable by General Conference, because to this day, complaints begin and end within their jurisdiction or their central conference overseas. So that was a big, big shift, which many people, I would say among them, believe led to what became, I call, the balkanization of the church. What began to happen is you had very different cultures that developed in different jurisdictions. So when bishops had to be elected by the whole church at General Conference, they had to be known to the whole church. They had to be acceptable to the whole church. Bishop Oliveto never could have been elected at General Conference, but she was by the jurisdiction, because in that small subculture, there was a different mindset had developed. So those were key developments. And by the way, they kind of knew that they were maybe moving in that direction. The Council of Bishops was not established till the 1940s because they realized even then that there might be a tendency with this new system of jurisdiction to parochialize the vision of the bishops. So the Council of Bishops was formed so that they would get together at least once a year, all the bishops of the church, to keep a kind of a big picture view in mind. I'm not sure that really worked because the Council of Bishops itself became divided. But so what's interesting, by the way, Scott Kisker out of United Seminaries has done some good writing on how this developed, especially with regard to the merger of 1939 and how bishops became severed from this kind of interlocking levels of accountability for bishops and others. So we've been moving towards a de facto regionalization over the last 100 years or so. And now what's being called for, I guess, is to kind of make that more officially the case. My concern about that is that you're simply going to continue this process of developing this kind of balkanization. You'll have very different cultures in very different parts of the world, bishops that are only really amenable to that area. And I think you're just putting off future divisions if you do that, because the idea of regionalization, as I understand it, is that there'll be some things that will apply to the whole church and then some things that will apply regionally. And if bishops are no longer bishops of the whole church, that becomes a real sticking point, I think, for how you maintain the unity of the church. Because they were really the connecting, prior to 1939, the bishops were the key connecting tissue to keeping a kind of unified church culture and doctrine between General Conference and the local level. And by the way, one last comment is that if you look back to many of our divisions over the years, bishops were at the center of it. In the 1790s, the Achilles schism to create the Republican Methodist Church was because James O'Kelly thought, Asbury had too much power. In 1820s, the Methodist Protestant Church, again, bishops had too much power. Methodist Protestants eliminated the office of bishop. And when they came back in 1939, I think 2 of their presidents became bishops, which would have made the founders roll in the graves, I'm sure. If you go to the North-South split over slavery in the 1840s, it was when slavery reached the episcopacy that it became a crisis point. And then I think similarly in 2016, when issues of sexuality reached the episcopacy, it became a crisis point. So when you look back, so many of the divisions also have, and you can say the same thing about United Brethren and evangelical church splits as well. Bishops were at the center of those. That's probably more than people need to know at this point, but at least gives you a kind of a thumbnail overview.
Additional things that just basics in this that people need to know is the United Methodist Church has now not just one practicing gay bishop, but 2. Cedric Bridgeforth was one of the new class that was brought in, I think, last year. Mm-hmm. It's hard to remember how recent. This has been going on for forever.
November 22.
Okay, so a year and a half ago. All right, thank you. Lonnie, you've submitted some legislation. Let's talk about legislation, because if I'm thinking sympathetically with the institution, okay, the regionalization plans submitted by the Connectional Table and the Christmas Covenant don't at all address this problem of episcopacy or general boards and agencies, which we've talked about why those 2 areas are so problematic. That's why we're talking about it today. It seems like you would be able to just simply adopt another petition that ameliorates these problems. So I haven't looked or read through all of the different petitions, but I'm seeing, I've got, Lonnie, your petition matrix open, and there are several that deal with problematic aspects of the episcopacy. 2 of them that I have right next to each other with your name on them are Episcopacy Regionalization / Implementation, and another one called Limited Tenure for Bishops and Relationship of Retired Bishops Implementation. It seems that some others have, there's 2 more from you. Episcopacy, Regionalization, Constitution, Limited Tenure for Bishop. No, that's the same thing. Okay, well, anyway, I have a hard time believing that nobody has seen these problems, that nobody has made a petition. How realistic do you think it is that they could adopt a regionalization petition for the episcopacy that does effectively complete this reformation that Forbes is talking about, and doesn't make it so that Bridgeforth and Oliveto are considered bishops of regions that would not have them?
Well, I think that the the move toward a reform in the episcopacy has been gaining strength, and I think the events, particularly in 2016, to which Joe referred, indicate that for us. Mind you, we need to be clear that reform of the episcopacy, I think, has two different aspects that are really important here. One is this idea of limiting tenure, and the other is the issue of regionalization. They're related, of course, but I don't think they're the same issue. And I think we need to be concerned about doing both those things with the episcopacy in terms of reform. And reform is absolutely essential. That petition that Joe was talking about that came from the Association of Annual Conference Lay Leaders in 2016. I was the chair of the legislation work in the association that year, and Simon worked with me on that. And so that petition for limiting tenure was a really viable proposal at that time, and that was shown by the vote. Actually, that got voted on twice. I'm not sure how what the process was that came up for the second vote, but on the first vote, that petition received 61.2% of the vote, and so that was just barely short of a supermajority of 67% that was required to make it church law. So we came really, really close, and that's compared to in the last several times it had been looked at, it didn't even come close to a majority vote. So that momentum was growing. And at the Western Jurisdictional Conference in November 2022, we had 30-some candidates for 3 episcopal positions. And every one of those candidates pledged him or herself to support limited tenure for bishops. So, I mean, this is something that the church, I believe, is ripe for, and that the viability is real of this kind of proposal for this upcoming General Conference. And I think that's true whether we think of it as part of the package of regionalization or as a separate issue. I think either way, it's ripe for passage. And I believe that the second level of episcopal reform here, of regionalization, is also ripe. And I believe that's true whether we roll it into the total regionalization of the church or think of it as something that can be done separately. It can be done separately. We don't have to regionalize the church in the way that the Christmas Covenant conceives, which does not comprehend regionalization of the episcopacy, which is in fact a real weakness in that proposal from my point of view. But it can be done as a standalone package. In fact, we could pass the Christmas Covenant and pass the proposal from me that you mentioned, Jeffrey, for regionalizing the episcopacy and affect then the regionalization in total. Or we could go ahead and defeat the Christmas Covenant, which in that case I wouldn't support that myself, but and regionalize the episcopacy as a separate issue. That could be done. I've got 2 packages of petitions then that would address episcopal reform. 2 petitions, one for the Constitution, one for the implementation for imposing limited tenure, and that's effectively a resubmission of the 2016 proposal from the Association of Annual Conference Lay Leaders, which did not reintroduce their petition. I did that. And then a separate pair doing the constitutional piece and then the implementation piece for regionalization of the episcopacy. And I would support both those things, get them both done.
Go ahead, Odell.
So I just want to make sure that for those of people at home who are keeping score and want to know where exactly we are in Volume 2, Section 2 of the ADCA. petition number 20678, which is limited tenure for bishops and relationships of retired bishops, which is a part of the Constitution. And the rationale that Lonnie gave is life tenure is inconsistent with realities of human development and interaction, accountability to the church, and changes for bishops demand elections be for limited terms. Moreover, membership of retired bishops should revert to the annual conference, and all bishops of the church should have the same term of office. I need some further clarification on petition 20678, Lonnie.
That's one of a pair. The second one is 20679 in the same volume. That's the implementation piece. But the one you referred to, the 78 one, that's the constitutional thing that would have to be done to make this possible, because the life tenure for the bishops within the United States and the jurisdictions is a constitutional provision. So we'd have to change that to have a limited term for bishops in the United States. And I believe that the accountability thing is a really important part of this, Odell, because one of the problems and the crying need for reform here, in my judgment, is the fact that even though the church provides officially a method for holding bishops accountable, in practical effect, it's impossible. We haven't been able to do that ever. Recently, we had a case in South Central jurisdiction where the Committee on Episcopacy of the jurisdiction declared one of the bishops to be ineffective and unqualified. And rather than just use their power that's assigned to that committee in the discipline to require that the bishop take early retirement, it said, we need to take this to the jurisdiction. So they did. They took it to the jurisdictional conference and presented their case. And the jurisdiction overwhelmingly supported the recommendation from the Committee on Episcopacy. The bishop appealed, as he's authorized to do, to the Judicial Council for review. And the Judicial Council, even though both the Committee on Episcopacy and the jurisdiction had said this bishop is ineffective and unqualified, said because of technicality in the procedure, they could not require that the bishop take early retirement. So they assigned him to another 4 years, and another 4 years after that until his mandatory retirement age was reached, and he then took retirement. But
Lonnie, it's gotten awkward. You're talking about this so long, but we don't know who you're talking about. Which bishop was that?
I'm not going to say.
Okay. I thought I was going to get you. I was surprised I didn't hear about this. I thought you were starting off talking about Carcanio, but you use the male pronouns. So I'm surprised I didn't hear about this. Of course, I am familiar with the process that was bungled, that Robert Barnes filed charges against Olivito that were dismissed and shouldn't have been. There were also charges that were attempted to be filed against Bridgeforth that were not entertained because the original filer made it public before doing it, and so they refused to hear the charges even. So yeah, this is a broken system. I did want to hear Simon. I like Simon's voice, and so I wanted to hear Simon. I wanted to hear you talk about if you agree that bishops have not been held accountable to the doctrine and discipline of the United Methodist Church. But I also want to hear you talk about, it's my understanding that African bishops have not even obeyed the mandatory retirement age or times when there should be new bishops elected. It's my understanding that African bishops have held on to authority longer than they should have, and that even the rules we have in the Book of Discipline are not being enforced for those bishops. So can you speak to any of that?
Thank you very much, Jeff, and the whole team. I would like to touch a bit on that. Because like Joe rightly explained how bishops, are expected to function, the collective responsibility they have to run the government of the church. And they are the custodians of the doctrines and the laws of our church. So in their general superintendent's roles, obviously, we expect them to supervise and guard those things jealously and make sure that they become the role models of our accountability system, being the bishops. So really, when you now look on the ground, we see a lot of gaps and breaches of the system that are so glaring. For instance, you already touched on the issue of mandatory retirement. We have raised these issues that, mandatory retirement is indeed mandatory. It doesn't matter if it's raining, there's an earthquake, whatever is happening, it's mandatory. If your age tells you that you're due for retirement, then you are due for retirement. And these are some of the questions that Africans have been raising, that all the other blocs had their elections vis-a-vis the mandatory, to place bishops in the mandatory retirement vacancies. Of course, the Americans had to put that request to the Judicial Council. They were given the right to do that as a once-off, and that was done in December 2022, right? And bishops started office 1st January 2020, the following year. And it was a once-off, it's not like a norm. And, the Eastern Europe bloc, I think elections were done. In the Philippines, elections were done. But in Africa, elections were not done. And if you recall, the news was there in the United Methodist News magazine that, the African bishops unanimously agreed that they would stay on until 2024. Then that begs a lot of questions. Do they unanimously agree, or do they follow provisions of the discipline or the mandatory retirement? Those are the questions. Because you can't gather around, and the funniest part of it is that those bishops, among them were about, I think, 4 affected bishops. And then they decide in their favor to then hang on until 2024. I think that's too glaring. And there are some questions that come to mind in terms of what the Book of Discipline says in terms of guiding mandatory retirement. Who would have expected that those who are supposed to step down would have stepped down? And it was the duty of the Council of Bishops to then find interim placements, like what they do when we lost our dear bishop in Sierra Leone. They have placed there an interim bishop, Bishop Warner Brown, who is serving until official elections are done to replace the late Bishop Yambasu. Who would have thought that they would have taken the same route, that those due for retirement, they step down. Then the Council of Bishops then places interim bishops. Or if they can recall them, they must step down first. Then they can be recalled to serve, but they don't go back and serve their areas that they're serving before retirement. Then we would have been in order if that was done. But unfortunately, it was not done. Those who were supposed to have retired in 2020 are still with us, on full salary, full-time bishops. Everything is normal until we get to the General Conference and then Central Conferences. And another interesting thing, if you check, I think there's an issue that we also, that was raised, I think, from some Zimbabweans. Another breach of the provisions. The Book of Discipline, a provision passed in 2016. I think it's paragraph 4081B, that a bishop in a central conference shall be retired not more, within a period not more than 3 months following adjournment of the General Conference session. Of course, there's that addition that when their 6th, 8th birthday comes, before the annual conference, is a given, it's known. So you find that in some of the areas in central conferences, they have set their central conferences in December. For example, Africa Central Conference. Our central conference has been slated for December, which is exactly 7 months following that adjournment of General Conference. So again, it begs a lot of questions. this provision is there, and it was with effect after the adjournment of General Conference 2016. But it was ignored. And the bishops decided to then put a date in December, the first week of December, that's when we have our elections of bishops in Africa Central Conference. Then they will do the handover, takeover somewhere end of December. Then the bishops will begin their office 1 January 2025. But if you go back to the discipline, it says all bishops, who are elected in the denomination, they start to work 1 September. Following the elections, following General Conference, they do the election 1 September, they're in office. So all those provisions are ignored. So we ask those questions, but we don't get answers. But those are some of the things that we seem to see happening. So, and
the reason I brought that up, if 1 second, the reason that this all dovetails for me is if we're looking at regionalizing the episcopacy. Right now, we still have an episcopacy where there's a common college of bishops where they're all holding each other accountable. And even right now, they're not able to compel each other to abide by the explicit instructions of the Book of Discipline. So if we imagine a successful regionalization of the episcopacy, why on earth do people imagine that then they will be able to maintain good order if they don't even have good order right now when the system is designed to have it? Regionalization will make it like they can have their own culture, their own kind of kingdom to themselves, and that all but guarantees, to my mind, that bishops and their conferences will split off even more culturally and theologically from whatever makes them United Methodists. That's the connection. That's the through line I'm drawing there. Simon, do you think that sounds like crazy talk?
It's not. I actually agree with you. It will just worsen things because the accountability system right now is not working. But once we regionalize, if we were to regionalize the episcopacy also, or the current setup in the proposals which are there, I can see things getting worse. And the idea of the unity within the denomination is gone. It don't be there anymore. So I see a lot of problems, the way we are going. I see a lot of problems.
When I was summing it up that way, Joe, I think you lifted your hand like you had something else to add to that. Go ahead.
I think it highlights the reality that no system can be maintained if you do not have people who are committed to upholding the principles of that system. I think that's a really important thing to say because, I didn't get into some of these details, but one of the things that happened in the wake of the 1939 reunion was that the system of government enshrined in the Constitution that later became part of the 68 was specifically kind of designed to reflect that of the American system of government. You had, up to that point, you had pretty much just the General Conference and the bishops. Then you had the creation of the Judicial Council. And I actually heard Bishop Scholl describe it in exactly those terms as being analogous to the U.S. system of government at the trial last fall here in Pennsylvania. So the legislative function is the General Conference. They form policy. The administrative branch is the bishops. They implement policy. And the Judicial Council adjudicates disputes. The problem that we have is that is when one branch, the administrative, runs roughshod over the others. So you have a situation where bishops are now ignoring or defying the enactments of the legislative branch or ignoring the decisions of the Judicial Council. As Simon has pointed out, but they're just ignoring these things and just kind of doing their own thing. And the problem there is, I don't know how you fix that because it's a failure of will on the part of
Joe,
what
we know from the American political context is when you have enough people breaking the rules, like drug law, then that's indicative that the law needs to go away. So you do what people in their wisdom in Oregon did, and you get rid of all the drug laws, and then people behave well, and the whole situation resolves itself. And of course, I'm being facetious right now because we're seeing that Oregon has turned into a wasteland as you have changed the notion. And Lovett Weems posted an article that had these same sympathies about 6 months ago, saying when you have a rule that nobody is obeying, well, that's a rule that you can ignore, and you should make adjustments because of it. People like me said, no, when a bunch of people are breaking the rules, a bunch of people need to get removed from their position of power, and if you don't, then the whole organization is now illegitimate because it's not defending itself.
Well,
so anyway, go ahead.
If you go back to using the American system of government analogy, what did the early founders were concerned about? They were concerned about tyranny of people with too much power, also tyranny of the mob, so to speak. So they had checks and balances so that they would all have these, they would have division of power, separation of powers.
And a real fear of standing armies.
Right. That was the case as well. But back when they call it a potential constitutional crisis when a president is thought that he might defy what the court says, right? Of course, we're in a land where that involves military and violence. Of course, the United Methodist Church doesn't have a police force, so we don't have. There's a great line in T.S. Eliot's poem, The Wasteland, where he takes aim at the notion that we can design systems so perfect that no one will have to be good.
Nice.
And if we don't have people that are principled and are willing to abide by what they have committed to, I don't know that any reforms in the long run can be effective.
That's a good soundbite. I hope I clip that up later. Odell.
You did?
Okay. The question that I have, and I'll come back to Alani because I have another question on one of his pieces of legislation, but actually the comment that I have is that I constantly have to remind people in the United Methodist Church and the North Georgia Conference that this system, even though it's set up as the United States, like the United States government, it is a system of checks and balances. And that the comments that the bishop said this and the bishop said that, and therefore we should be doing it, is something that you would hear in the Church of God in Christ or in another denomination in which there are no checks and balances. Because as in the Black church, we're very familiar with bishops who there are no system of laity to actually hold bishops accountable, where the bishops run over the lay folks as well as the church and cause real harm and damage because the systems of checks and balances do not exist. And that is the problem that I think we're going to have at General Conference as well as in the United Methodist Church going in the future. We don't do as the bishops say, we do as the General Conference, because only the General Conference speaks for the United Methodist Church. And we have some bishops who are doing whatever they want to do, and it's more than just in the Western jurisdiction, and they're not obeying the book of discipline, and we don't have order. Why do we have church law? It is for the purpose of order in the church. And if bishops arbitrarily are doing things, if I'm a layperson and I am arbitrarily doing something, I expect church discipline. I don't see church discipline with our bishops, and therefore that's part of the reason why we have people leaving, is because we have folks who are a little authoritative and there's no checks and balances and no complaint process. I'm a government employee. There is a whistleblower line in every government organization that I've worked at. There is a process, due process system for a complaint that is filed. And I just don't see that happening in the United Methodist Church. And that's problematic for a lot of people in the pews.
Well, for those who don't take Odell's word for it, I did do a prolonged interview with Robert Barnes as he talked about how his particular complaint was filed and handled against Bishop Olivito. He had postmarked correspondences with the bishops who were responsible for overseeing that. He had direct quotes for how and why it was that they dismissed the charges, even though they shouldn't have. And of course, every story is going to be a little bit different, but it begins to form a general picture of a church, a denomination that has lost a notion of any order that goes against the consciences of the people that are responsible for enforcing it. So it's a big mess, and of course that's why this legislation is produced to try and fix the mess. The conservative answer was more rules, mandatory minimum punishments. You know, the what was it in 2019? The traditional plan was passed with a bunch of strictures that was renounced as unnecessarily harsh and vindictive. But if not that, then what? Is there any kind of realistic counterproposal that is going to set things right again? I haven't heard or seen any of it. That doesn't mean it doesn't exist. I haven't read through the ADCA the way that a couple of you guys have. Has anyone seen anything in the ADCA that you think would really solve the culture and exercise of power and authority among the Episcopacy? Lonnie, you've got something.
Well, I have an idea. It's sort of a philosophical point, but the truth is that the more local government is, in my judgment, the more effective government is. And that's why I believe that there is some hope that regionalization will lead to more accountability, because it will localize, to some degree at least, the accountability, and particularly when we're talking here, as we are right now in this session, about regionalization of the episcopacy. That when the bishops become elected by and serve within, which is what regionalization of the episcopacy does, a regional conference, or actually, if you just apply the proposal as I've submitted it, it talks about jurisdictions and the central conferences, but it would apply if we regionalize to the regional conferences then. But whatever the local region is, the bishops would be elected by that region and serve within that region, and we would do away with the transfer clause from jurisdiction to another of the bishops. Now, mind you, that's in there. We've never used that. No bishop has ever transferred between jurisdictions. But in any case, regionalization will lead to more accountability as a general principle. Now, how effective we will be within any given region of applying those provisions for accountability, that's subject to question. I don't know the answer to that.
Lonnie, you said a new thought. I had not considered that before. I'm a big fan of local government, and I want to agree with you. I just still think these regional conferences are still way too big to ameliorate the large systemic forces that we've seen. But I can be wrong about a lot of things. But that's a very interesting idea, Lonnie. I think that's worthy of the time you spent well, you didn't take a lot of time, so thanks for saying that. We need to wrap on this. Closing meditations that you guys think our viewers, listeners need to hear, or have we done a perfect job, and do I need to hit end record?
I think we probably gave them enough for one session.
Nice. Okay. Well, friends, we thank you for joining us. It's obviously a big topic. It's probably bigger. It's bigger than I knew we were going to get into this morning. And I think we're gonna cut this up in 2 parts. Actually, I think it was too much. So we'll talk about that later. But we sure enjoy having people along for the ride as we learn from each other, and then just look at all the same stuff and see what's obviously true, what's not obviously true, what's just up in the air. So continue to pray for the United Methodist Church as they approach the General Conference. Make sure to reach out to us if there's anything big and broad that we're not seeing. plainspokenpod@gmail.com is the email address. And then share this with your friends that care about the United Methodist Church and don't always trust the denominational resources that prepackage things. I mean, I'm sure those are great, but this is just lay people and clergy that are earnestly digesting what they know to be true about the denomination. And we're doing it because we're hoping it's helpful to you. So if it is, share it, comment, like it, and then stay tuned for next week's segment. I have no idea what we're doing, but it's going to be great. So we'll see you guys later.